On February 23, 1945, 6 Marines climbed the steep slopes of Mount Suribachi, carrying a length of pipe and a folded American flag. What they did that day was simple. They planted the flag at the summit. What happened next was not simple at all. Joe Rosenthal, an Associated Press photographer, captured the moment the men heaved the flagpole upright against the wind. The photo was published 2 days later, and within weeks it had become one of the most reproduced images in history. To millions of Americans back home, weary of war and grieving for sons lost in Europe and the Pacific, the photograph was not just news. It was hope, victory, and proof that the sacrifices had meaning. In the collective imagination, the flag raising marked the end of the battle. But on Iwo Jima itself, the reality was far darker. The bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. The image came at a critical moment. For the United States, 1945 was a year of exhaustion. After years of combat, the public was desperate for signs that victory was near. War bonds needed selling, morale needed lifting, and faith in the fight against Japan needed to be renewed. Rosenthal's photograph delivered all of this in a single frame. Straining figures, captured in silhouette, working together to raise the flag against a barren volcanic sky. Here was America's story distilled into pure symbolism. President Roosevelt himself called it a symbol of the unconquerable spirit of the American people. Within days, 3 of the Marines in the photo were flown back to the U.S. to lead bond drives that raised hundreds of millions of dollars. The war effort gained a new surge of energy thanks to one frozen instant on Mount Suribachi. Yet behind the image was a messier truth. The flag that Rosenthal photographed was not the first to be raised that day. Hours earlier, a smaller flag had already gone up, visible from the beaches below and sparking cheers from thousands of Marines still fighting for their lives. The second flag was raised on orders from commanders who wanted a larger banner more visible across the island. By chance, Rosenthal caught this second flag, and history forgot the first. Worse, the identities of the flag raisers were confused for decades, with some men credited, others forgotten, and families left with uncertain legacies. The photo that won the war was born of chance, error, and myth-making, layered over the reality of an island still burning with combat. The hook of the story is simple. A photograph captured a nation's imagination. But the truth of Iwo Jima was not in the photo. It was in the caves, the tunnels, and the 30 days of fighting still ahead. The flag was a moment of light in a battlefield of darkness. It did not end the war, but it showed America what victory could look like. The photograph that electrified the American home front did not spring from careful staging, but from chaos. Joe Rosenthal had landed on Iwo Jima with the Marines, braving the same fire and ash. When he climbed Mount Suribachi on the 23rd of February, he carried no certainty that he would capture anything meaningful. In fact, when asked later whether the flag raising had been posed, Rosenthal replied, "If I had posed that picture, I would have had them all looking at the camera." What he witnessed was a handful of exhausted men obeying an order: replace the first flag with a larger one. The names of those men, Harlan Block, Rene Gagnon, Ira Hayes, Franklin Sousley, Michael Strank, and Harold Schultz, would become famous, though even their identities were misattributed for years. 3 of them would never leave Iwo Jima alive. The confusion began almost immediately. The smaller flag, raised earlier, had already served as a beacon of triumph. Commanders wanted a larger, more visible standard to rally the Marines still pinned down in the northern half of the island. So a patrol carried the replacement up the mountain. Rosenthal clicked his shutter at precisely the right instant, the men straining, bodies angled, flagpole tilting against the wind. It looked effortless, heroic, almost sculptural. No one in the photograph could have imagined the consequences. The Associated Press transmitted it worldwide within hours, and newspapers across America ran it on front pages. To a public fatigued by casualty reports, the image was oxygen. To the government, it was a weapon, an instrument of morale and finance. The U.S. Treasury quickly realized the photograph's potential. The Seventh War Loan Drive, a massive effort to fund the war's final phase, needed a symbol that could ignite patriotism and generosity. The surviving flag raisers were flown home and paraded across the country. They were not professional speakers, nor comfortable celebrities. They were young men pulled from the volcanic nightmare of Iwo Jima and thrust into stadiums, parades, and press conferences. Millions of dollars poured in as Americans bought bonds, convinced they were witnessing the very moment of victory. The irony was bitter. As the nation celebrated, the battle on Iwo Jima raged on for another month, and Marines continued to die in the shadow of Suribachi. The manipulation of the image was deliberate. Propaganda offices plastered it across posters, stamps, and billboards. Politicians quoted it as proof of national resolve. It was no longer simply a photograph, it was a narrative, stripped of its complications, repurposed as a promise of inevitable triumph. The men in the photo became symbols rather than soldiers, carrying the weight of a nation's expectations. And yet, for all the myth-making, they themselves knew the truth. The flag was up, but the killing had not stopped. Iwo Jima was still a cauldron, and the war was far from won. While the photographs soared through newspapers and onto billboards, the men still on Iwo Jima waded through slaughter. The flag raising did not silence the guns. In fact, the fiercest battles were only beginning. The northern half of the island was a labyrinth of ridges, caves, and interlocked fields of fire. Marines who had cheered when they saw the stars and stripes on Suribachi were ordered to advance into ground nicknamed Meat Grinder and Death Valley. Every advance was measured in yards, every day in hundreds of casualties. Japanese defenders, hidden in their tunnels, emerged at night to cut throats or launch sudden counterattacks. Artillery, impossible to locate, rained down from concealed bunkers. The myth of a victorious climax on February 23rd shattered quickly. The island would not be declared secure until March 26th, more than a month later. For the men in the photo, the story turned even darker. 3 never made it off the island. Sergeant Michael Strank, a respected leader, was killed by friendly artillery just days after the flag went up. Harlan Block and Franklin Sousley both died in combat before the end of March, buried in the same volcanic soil they had fought to claim. The surviving trio, René Gagnon, Ira Hayes, and Harold Schultz, were pulled from the nightmare and sent home as reluctant heroes. Gagnon struggled with the sudden fame, trapped between the government's need for a symbol and his own private battle with survivor's guilt. Hayes, a Pima Deef American, found the attention unbearable, and though he endured the bond tours, he later descended into alcoholism, haunted by what he had seen. Schultz, silent for decades, never spoke publicly about being one of the flag raisers. Their faces were immortalized, but their humanity was consumed by the myth. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Marines still faced the reality of Iwo Jima. Medics operated in open sand, surgeons amputated by the light of lanterns, and stretcher teams carried the wounded under relentless fire. Navy corpsmen, wearing nothing but armbands for identification, became prime targets for Japanese snipers. For every heroic image, there were hundreds of untold moments. A buddy dragged from the surf, a whispered prayer before another charge, a letter home stained with blood. These were the truths the photo could not capture, and yet they defined the battle more than any single frame. The contrast was stark. While America celebrated the triumph of Suribachi, its Marines were still locked in a death struggle that mocked the illusion of quick victory. Thus, the photo became a paradox. It lifted a nation's spirit, funded the war, and offered hope. But for the men who fought and died in the Black Sands, it felt like a cruel trick of perspective. The image suggested an ending. In truth, it was only the beginning of the bloodiest month of their lives. When the last guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima in late March 1945, the photograph of the flag raising had already outlived the battle. It had been turned into stamps, posters, statues, and headlines, frozen as the defining image of American victory. Yet the men who fought there knew that reality was far harsher. Nearly 7,000 Americans lay dead, more than 20,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison had been annihilated, almost to the last man. The island was captured, but not cleanly, not in the glorious surge suggested by the photo. It was taken yard by yard, through tunnels blasted with flamethrowers, through caves filled with smoke and corpses. Still, for the public, the image triumphed over the truth. The war bond drives raised billions, ensuring that the final push against Japan would be funded. In that sense, the photo did not just win hearts, it helped win the war. The legacy of the image only grew after 1945. In Arlington, Virginia, the Marine Corps War Memorial immortalized the moment in bronze, towering above visitors as a symbol of sacrifice and unity. Generations of Americans came to see the sculpture not as a record of one day on Iwo Jima, but as a representation of the entire Marine Corps ethos. Uncommon valor was a common virtue, Admiral Nimitz had said of the battle, and the memorial seemed to make his words permanent. The photograph became shorthand for victory, for brotherhood, for the cost of freedom. It outshone the complicated details, the misidentifications, even the forgotten first flag. In the public imagination, 6 men raising a pole came to embody an entire war. Yet the myth carried weight for those who lived with it. Ira Hayes returned home a celebrity, but could not escape the shadows of the battlefield. His story ended tragically, a reminder that glory on paper does not heal the wounds of war. Families of misidentified Marines wrestled with decades of confusion. Historians continued to debate the balance between the image as propaganda and the battle as lived reality. Even in Japan, the photo was recognized as the visual declaration that the empire's defenses could not hold forever. Iwo Jima had fallen, and the world had seen it happen in a single frame. Today, the photograph remains both iconic and misleading. It is a window into a moment that inspired millions, yet it conceals the agony, the attrition, and the unfinished struggle still raging when the shutter clicked. Perhaps that is why it endures, because it captures not what was, but what people needed to believe. A war is never won by one picture, but sometimes one picture can carry a nation through the blood it takes to finish it.